right? Watching all the
names
go up.
It's like
So when you do your introductions, is that when we should kill our videos?
we only have 1 hour, which will go by quite quickly. And so again, good morning. My name is Dan Kelting, and I am the Executive Director of the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute. And I want to welcome everyone to our second webinar in a 4-webinar series. Ask the Expert is the name of the series. And this has been organized by the Adirondack Research Consortium. It's a 4-part series, as I mentioned. And so next week is going to focus on cultural geography of the Adirondacks. And the final webinar series will focus on forest policy. I want to emphasize to everyone that this series is brought to you free. That is, there's no registration fee charged by the Adirondack Research Consortium, but they are a 501c3 nonprofit. They certainly would appreciate a donation to them to support their continuing efforts and ability to offer programs like this to the public. And maybe Zoe Smith is on here. She could type their address into the chat for folks to visit their website to make a donation if you so choose. So today's webinar is focused on modern threats, or some modern and current threats to Adirondack waters. We'll be covering aquatic invasive species, road salt, and septic issues. And with me to answer your questions on these topics are Erin, Vennie-Vollrath, and Erin, give a wave. Erin is a coordinator with the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. We also have Brendan Wiltse. Hey, Brendan. Brendan is a water quality director with the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute. And then we have Chris Navitsky, who's Lake George Waterkeeper and also with the Fund for Lake George. The way we're going to run this is each panelist is going to go in turn. Each one is going to take just a few minutes to share some thoughts about their particular topic, and then they're going to answer your questions. And so what I ask folks to do is, as you're listening to a panelist, if you have a question, you want to type those questions into the Q&A, which, depending on the type of computer you have, if it's an IBM, it should be on the bottom. So just click on the Q&A and type your question in there. And so what I will do is at the end of the person's, the panelist's presentation, I will facilitate a question and answer session based on the questions that you posted. And we also received a few questions online, and I'll be feathering those questions in as well. So we'll do that 3 times. We're going to begin with Erin, then we're going to have Brendan present on road salt and talk with you about road salt, and then we'll conclude with Chris Navitsky in septic systems. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Erin to talk to us about aquatic invasive species. Erin?
Great, thank you so much for having me on today, everyone, and for coming to the presentations this morning. I'm gonna start sharing my screen here in PowerPoint mode. And I don't have many slides. I just wanted to provide a quick overview about aquatic invasive species and the work that's being done in the Adirondacks around them. And so, as Dan said, my name's Erin Vennie-Vollrath, and I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Project Coordinator at the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And for those who aren't familiar with APIP, we are one of the 8 PRISMs, or Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management, in the state of New York, which is the map that you're seeing there in the middle. And so no matter where you are in the state of New York, you have staff that are dedicated on working on invasive species issues. And so for APIP specifically, our mission is to protect the Adirondack region from the negative impacts of invasive species. And we do that through 3 goals. The first is to work with partners to prevent new introductions to the region. The second goal is to rapidly detect and respond to any new infestations. And then we also do some long-term management of infestations to mitigate their negative impacts. And so our program is housed at the Nature Conservancy in Keene Valley. We're funded through the Department of Environmental Conservation through a 5-year contract with them. And then we also have 2 other founding partners for the program, the Adirondack Park Agency and the Department of Environmental Conservation. And then we work with many, many different partners throughout the region to address invasive species issues. So just to give a quick overview about the impacts of aquatic invasive species that we see for those who aren't very familiar with it, is that when it does come into a lake, when an invasive comes into a lake, and I have an example here, one of our most widespread invasives, Eurasian water milfoil. Often with invasive aquatic plants, they tend to make these dense beds or monocultures of just that invasive species, which can have a lot of impacts on our lakes. For example, if you can imagine with these large mats, not a lot of sun is getting through those, so we have shading of our native species that might be trying to grow underneath. We have changes in the pH and the temperatures in those beds. They outcompete a lot of our native species for different resources. And then we have impacts to things like recreation. If you can imagine, it's not fun to paddle or swim or try to fish through a bed like this. And then we also see impacts to our property values. A study done in Vermont found that there was an up to 16% reduction in property values when Eurasian water milfoil came into a lake and became very abundant, like we see in this photo. In the Adirondacks, through the work of APIP staff, partners, and volunteers, we've been surveying lakes in the Adirondacks for aquatic invasive species. And to date, we've been able to survey over 400 lakes. We typically focus on big lakes that have a lot of access points, whether those are boat launches or beaches. And we've found that we're at 75% now are still free of aquatic invasive species. And so we have a lot of opportunity in the Adirondacks to try to keep our lakes free of these aquatic invasives. We also see that the ones that do have an aquatic invasive species, the vast majority only have 1 or 2. So the focus in the region with our relatively uninvaded landscape is that we focus very heavily on prevention, early detection, and rapid response. And so my example here in the photo is just a handful of water chestnut plants that are in a lake just, it's in Lake Alice, just northwest of Plattsburgh. And if you can imagine at this point, it's pretty easy for us, or it's pretty, not very time consuming to go in and hand harvest those few plants. And if we do that for multiple years in a row, we have a high probability of getting rid of the water chestnut out of this lake. So thinking about prevention, we do have a lot of sources of aquatic invasive species in the landscape around us. A lot of our big water bodies like the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, the Hudson River, and then Lake Champlain do have a lot of both invasives and non-native species in them. And we know, thanks to the work of our partners at the Adirondack Watershed Institute, Paul Smith College, and the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and other people running boat steward programs at the boat launches, helping boat stewards both inspect their watercraft, remove any attached plants and animals, and then they're also talking to the boaters and asking them, what boat were you, or what lake were you at before you came to this lake? And through that great work, we're able to see, where people are coming from before they come to the Adirondacks. And we're seeing that they are often coming from those waters that have a lot of aquatic invasive species. And so the work of that spread prevention is really, really important to try to make sure that nobody's bringing those invasives to our waters when they come to visit. And then our program focuses a lot on early detection surveys. So we have both professional staff that we hire in the summer that go out to do early detection surveys. And then we have different networks of volunteers that do surveys for us, both in front country lakes, and then we work with Adirondack Mountain Club to do surveys in some of the backcountry waters as well. And we've seen, this graph that I'm showing is the number of cumulative uninvaded lakes and invaded lakes that we've seen over time. And so as you can see, we're able to every year add to the number of lakes that have been surveyed. And over the last few years, we've had only a small handful of newly reported invaded lakes. And many of those instances are lakes that had established populations for a long time and just had not been reported to us yet. And so there's a lot of promise that we're seeing through extensively, the spread prevention programs in the region, and then also early detection and rapid response work, that we're not seeing a lot of new invasives popping up in our landscape. And we have a lot of eyes out there in the field looking for invasives to respond quickly if it is found. And with that, I just am happy to start a discussion with the group to see what questions you have about aquatic invasive species. And if for some reason we don't get a chance to answer questions now, feel free to reach out to me via email or through our website as well to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Erin. So folks, again, if you have a question that you'd like to post for Erin, please type it into the Q&A on your computer. I have so some questions for you, Erin. You so those nice graphics and the distribution of plants and kind of the vectors of pressure into the Adirondacks, and then thinking about the organisms that are here or maybe coming here, which one or ones do you consider to be the biggest threats to the Adirondacks?
So there's one that we classify as our tier 1 that we're very concerned is going to come to the Adirondacks and is not yet in it. And so I'd say that would be hydrilla. It's in about 20 water bodies, or I think it's up to maybe 25 water bodies in the state of New York. And it's been explained to me as the Godzilla of aquatic invasive plants because it grows very, very quickly. It's been seen to outcompete or kind of push out Eurasian water milfoil. And it grows into these dense beds that would just have lots of negative impacts, both to the economy and to the lake. It's the lake that it is introduced to. And so happily, it's not yet in the Adirondacks, but I know it's been found on a few boats on occasion coming into the Adirondacks through the boat steward programs. So it has the potential to pop up here. It happily has not yet, but I'd say that's one of our biggest concerns.
Great, and I guess a sort of a follow-up to that in terms of steps to mitigate invasives that are currently here.
And so definitely, I highlighted the concept of boats coming from other regions and coming into the Adirondacks, bringing invasives, but we also already do have invasives in the region that we're worried will get moved, from one lake to another. So really, I mean, the best way that we're making, to combat invasives is to prevent the spread from the lakes that they're already in. And so it's making sure that people first know about aquatic invasive species and then how to make sure that they're not moving it from lake to lake. And so the mantra with that is, clean, drain, and dry. So make sure that your boats, your equipment, anything that's been in contact with water, you inspect it. You remove any attached plants or animals from it. You drain any water that might be holding small invasive organisms, and then let everything dry completely. We say for at least 5 days. Now that we're in the fall and it's colder and wetter, I would wait a lot longer than 5 days before moving that equipment to another water body. And otherwise, there are in the summer the boat wash stations that are run, thankfully, through Dan's program, the boat steward program. And so you can visit those boat wash stations as well around the region to clean your equipment with a high pressure hot water wash, which would also kill and remove attached invasive species.
Thanks, Erin. There's an interesting question about, so we've seen this summer a large increase in hikers coming to the Adirondacks. So what about boats? Are we seeing more boats, and how does that relate to concerns about trying to prevent aquatic invasive species?
Well, and yeah, I mean, I've definitely heard that there are a lot more boaters, and Dan, you can address this much better than I can with what your boat stewards were seeing this summer. So actually, if you're okay with it, I'm gonna bow to you to address that a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah, sure. Just briefly, just compared to last summer, just looking at the numbers, we're about 25% higher in terms of boats launching at our site. So that's a pretty good increase over last year. So we definitely see that. Now we're not sure how that compares to prior years, because I just looked at last summer, but I think the assumption is that it's higher because of more visitors. And certainly we've heard a lot of stories this summer about filled parking lots and angry boaters who can't find a place to park their boats. So anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there's been just a tremendous more boat traffic and utilization this summer than prior years. Here's an interesting one. So really interesting, are all aquatic invasive species a result of human activities? So I'm guessing, is their presence a result of human activities, or do some find their way into the lakes by natural means?
There's definitely evidence of some natural avenues or vectors moving invasive species around. I would say before I go into that the vast majority seem to be moved by human activity, whether that's through movement of boats and other watercraft, or moving floating docks or canal systems. It seems to be mostly human movement that is moving invasives, but there are some that we see hitching rides on on waterfowl, for example. So one example of that would be European frogbit, which is a small floating leaf invasive species that we have just in a few areas in the Adirondacks. But it pops up in very remote areas, at least from what we've seen so far, that seem to only be waterfowl that we see swimming around in that. So it does vary how invasive species are getting moved around. But for the vast majority, it is human activity.
Thanks. Sort of back to the human transport. Are there any boats or boaters that are at higher risk of transporting invasives? So certain types of boats or.
Well, and what I'm pulling from is largely the boat steward data that you guys have pulled together and analyzed. And from and you can correct me on this, Dan, but from what I've seen, it definitely is the motorized boats that we're seeing the most hitchhikers on. There's just so many more places on motorized watercraft that invasive species can get trapped on. For example, you see aquatic plants wrapped around the motor. Often they have those carpeted bunks on the trailers that can catch invasive species. So it is the largest number on the motorized boats, but there are also on occasion invasive species attached to canoes and kayaks and paddle boards as well.
Great. It's a nice one, just thinking about our changing climate. And so is climate change impacting invasive species?
And most definitely. A lot of, when we look at the different potential invasive species that could come to the Adirondacks, we often see that our cold winters would likely kill a lot of the invaders that we might be most worried about. But as our winters are less harsh and shorter, there's more chance of different invasives overwintering in our lakes. And then we might also see, with the warmer temperatures, different impacts, such as in some cases, we'd have harmful algal blooms that aren't invasive, but could be, supported more by some certain invasive species. And so we would have more harmful algal blooms with those warmer temperatures as climate change warms everything. And then I guess I will just say one more thing. This isn't so much with aquatic invasives, but with some of our terrestrial invasive species, we are seeing with the warming temperatures changes in how effective some of our management is as well.
Thank you. Maybe one last question, and this one maybe relates to the one you just answered, but what's on the horizon, I guess, in terms of aquatic invasive species in our region or in general?
And what I would highlight is kind of the exciting new ways that we might be able to monitor for aquatic invasive species. And so it's something called environmental DNA. Has been around for, people have been working with environmental DNA for a long time. So it's DNA that different organisms have shed while they're, in the water, whether that's through shedding cells, their scales or things passing through them. And so there's a lot of work being done with being able to take water samples and then running that through and looking for invasive species or evidence of invasive species. And so as that evolves and gets more efficient, I think it's pretty exciting if we would be able to just go get a water sample from a lake and run that through and look to see what invasives are there. Would be very time efficient. And so I'm excited to see where that goes.
Great. Well, thank you, Erin. There's a lot of questions left that we didn't get to answer. I'm going to try to, I'm not sure if Erin's able to see those, but maybe while Brendan is speaking, we could try to address some of those questions by typing them in. So thank you, Erin, for your discussion. We're going to switch it over now to Brendan Wiltse, who is going to walk us through issues and questions you have related to road salt. Brendan?
Great, thank you, Dan. So yeah, I'm going to be speaking about road salt pollution in the Adirondack region. I'll start out with this photo here, this cover slide, which we'll see a section of Route 3 between Saranac Lake and Bloomingdale covered in salt during a winter storm or after a winter storm a few years ago. So when we refer to road salt, that's a general term that encompasses a lot of different materials that can be put on our roads in the winter time to help maintain them free of snow and ice. It's primarily sodium chloride, but we also may have mixtures of sodium chloride with magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, potassium chloride, and those are the main materials that we're concerned about with road salt pollution. And there are other de-icing chemicals that may be used, not typically on our roads, but on airport runways and maybe in limited applications on sidewalks or entryways, and those are acetate-based de-icing products, usually liquid products. So we haven't always used salt to maintain our roads free of snow and ice in the wintertime. It was actually first used in 1938 in New Hampshire. And then in the early 40s, adoption of its use started picking up nationally. And we saw this sort of from the 40s through the early 70s, this exponential increase in its adoption nationwide. This figure here is just showing the total amount of salt used in the United States for road de-icing purposes in millions of tons from 1940 to 2017. So we see this exponential increase occurring from the 40s to the 70s, and then for about a 20-year period where we had plateaued in our use nationally, and then we saw a big jump in the 90s, a lot more variability year to year, and again this increasing trend through today. And the most recent data on this figure anyways, we're using about 25 million tons of this material on our roadways in the United States each year. And the story in the Adirondacks is very similar. So in the Adirondack Park, based on work that Dan and other colleagues have done, we use just shy of 200,000 tons in the Adirondack Park each year. A little more than half of that goes onto the state roads, a little less than half of that goes onto local roads. But there is much more state road or much more local road in the Adirondack Park, which are all the gray and black lines on this map, compared to state roads, which are red. And that means that the state roads receive about 3.5 times the amount of salt per mile of road compared to our local roads. And that is largely a function of the fact that state roads are higher speed roads, major connectors between communities, but also they're maintained under the guidance of New York State DOT or directly maintained by DOT or contracted to a municipality for their maintenance. And that, because we have one entity managing those state roads, it's a consistent maintenance across that road network, whereas local roads, we see a lot of variation in terms of how they're maintaining the roads. Everything from just plowing to using a sand salt mixture to using pure salt on their roads as well. The concern about this application is that this road network in the Adirondack Park is hydrologically connected to 77% of the lake's surface area and 52% of the stream length. So there is potential for significant regional salinization as the result of this application of salt to the road network. And we do in fact see regional surface water salinization in the Adirondacks. Dan and colleagues here at AWI have published work on this, showing in particular a significant relationship between the density of state road in a lake's watershed and the amount of sodium and chloride that is found in that lake. I wanted just to show you examples from two lakes that demonstrate the trends that we've been seeing over time in our water bodies. So these are data from Lake Champlain, you know, the sixth Great Lake and our largest water body in our region. These are long-term monitoring data from 1992 through 2007 for 14 stations spread throughout throughout Lake Champlain. In 9 out of those 14 stations, the ones colored in red, we see significant increases in chloride over this period of time. 2 of them, the ones in green, are showing significant declines, but I would note that the magnitude of those declines is smaller than the magnitude of increase at the other locations. And then 3 show no significant change. So this is a large water body, and we're seeing this signal of increasing chloride concentrations quite clearly in the lake. We look at the tributaries flowing into the lake. All 8 major tributaries on the New York side of the basin are showing significant increases in chloride over this time period. And then on the Vermont side, it's 5 out of the 10 major tributaries are showing a significant increase. From the very large Lake Champlain to the very small Mirror Lake, we see, again, similar trends. These are data for Mirror Lake, which is in the village of Lake Placid, just down not too far from Paul Smith College. We've been working on this water body for a number of years now. And again, we have more limited data for Mirror Lake, but we have data going back farther in time back to 1974, where the surface water chloride concentration was 4 milligrams per liter. And today the surface water concentration is hovering around 40 to 45 milligrams per liter. And the concentration at the bottom of the lake on average is around 80 milligrams per liter, but can be as high as 120 milligrams per liter. And as a point of reference for these numbers in lakes that are not impacted by roads in the Adirondacks, we have a median concentration of chloride of 0.24 milligrams per liter. So these numbers are much higher than what we would expect to find in an Adirondack lake. And they are starting to go over thresholds that recent research are suggesting will have potential effects on aquatic life, particularly zooplankton, which are small animals in the lake. And that threshold is 40 milligrams per liter, which Mirror Lake is now above. We also have evidence of regional groundwater salinization. And we've seen, for years, we've been monitoring streams, and we see these late summer increases in the salt concentration, which led us to hypothesize that there was groundwater salinization, because this is a time of year when our streams are at their lowest flow and are what we call base flow, which is primarily fed by groundwater. So we're seeing this signal in the stream. At AWI, we've sampled over 500 wells private wells across the Adirondack Park. And then we do in fact see a very similar trend to what we saw in our surface water analysis, which is higher concentrations of salt in lakes that are downslope of state roads. We see that same pattern with the groundwater data, where 64% of the wells that are downslope of state roads exceed the sodium drinking water guidance value of 20 parts per million, whereas only 20% exceed it from local roads, and wells that are upslope of all roads do not exceed these values. For chloride, the guidance value is higher because it's mostly associated with taste versus this is health-related guidance for people that are at high risk of certain diseases like high blood pressure, kidney failure, those sorts of things. So we see the same pattern. The numbers are just lower, 29% exceedance below downslope of state roads and 3% for local roads. There was a study done up in New Orleans, New York, and St. Lawrence County by researchers out of Virginia Tech. They're the same folks that worked on the Flint, Michigan water crisis. And they found a very similar pattern that we've seen in our data. And they took what they found, and they modeled it across New York State. And they estimate that as many as 460,000 private well users, or 25% of the well population in New York State, may have wells that are contaminated or influenced by road salt runoff coming off of roads, as opposed to groundwater contamination that's a result of being in proximity to a salt storage facility. So this issue is, the science is still evolving on this, and we're still gaining more and more understanding about it, but there's plenty of evidence out there that we have surface water salinization in the Adirondacks and impacts as a result of that, as well as groundwater salinization, which then extends this into a concern for property values, human health, and a lot of other things that I think people are going to be concerned about. So I'm happy for questions, and if folks do want to reach out to me here at the Watershed Institute, my email address is bwiltse@paulsmith.edu.
Thanks, Brendan. I just wanted to, before I open up the questions, I just wanted to let folks know that we held a program in August for a week. It's called Water Week, and a lot of these materials we have detailed presentations that we'll be making available that folks can take a look at that provide a lot more information and in depth on these topics. So we'll make sure to get that out to folks as well. So a lot of questions for Brendan on road salt, as you would expect. A couple of them just related to the use of salt in New York State relative to other places. So a question, does New York State use more salt per mile of road compared to other northern states?
And Dan, feel free to jump in, because Dan's been the one that's looked a little bit more closely at this state-to-state comparison, but New York is one of the highest applicators per lane mile in the country in terms of its salt use. There is some variation year to year in terms of a severity of the winter and weather in particular geographies from year to year that may push one state up or down in their use one year versus the next.
Are there any good alternatives that are effective for melting snow versus just using sodium chloride?
There are a lot of options. There's no silver bullet, so we can't point to one chemical or practice that would solve the problem tomorrow. There's been a lot of good work down in the Lake George region. Chris Navitsky, who's on the call, has been working on that, as well as we've been in the Ausable River Association has been doing work in Lake Placid. There's things like new plow technologies that conform to the shape of the roads, which means that if you take more material off the road surface in front of the truck, you should be able to get away with putting less salt down behind the truck. Brining technology has showed a lot of promise. It's bit more technical in its application and the things that highway professionals have to think about and prepare for to use brine effectively, but that can be very effective, especially at preventing the bond of snow and ice to our road surfaces. And the thing that I always tell people is if you've ever woken up a little late in the morning after a snowstorm and gone to shovel, and you didn't shovel your driveway, and you came back in the afternoon and went to shovel it, you know that it's pretty easy to get the snow off everywhere except for where you walked and your car tires went. And so pre-treating roads with brine prevents that bonding from happening, allowing plowing to be effective throughout a storm. So it's all of these little best practices that add up into a net cumulative effect that could result in pretty significant decreases in our salt use. We've seen in certain areas anywhere from 30 to a 50% decrease as a result of adoption of these practices.
Right. So Brendan, you showed a lot of data on salt impacts and the salinization piece for water bodies. What about the impacts on the aquatic ecosystem themselves? So what are the implications of having higher salt in a water body?
Yeah, so they vary across the food web, which is important in and of itself, because it means that certain parts of the food web can be affected, and that can have reverberations up and down. So certain phytoplankton are very sensitive, and they'll shift and quickly be replaced by other phytoplankton. Second to that, the zooplankton are sort of the next most sensitive thing, and the importance about that is they sit in the middle of the aquatic food web. So they are grazing down the phytoplankton, which most people like them doing that because it keeps your lake nice and clear and the color nice. It's not going to be green. And they also serve as an important food source to fish, which is something that a lot of lake shore owners are interested in. And so if we see declines in those organisms in the middle of the food web, we potentially see increased phytoplankton biomass in lakes, as well as impacts on fish. And then the last ecosystem effect that is important, that's not very common, but is occurring in the Adirondacks, is in Mirror Lake. The lake is not mixing the way it should because of the amount of salt that's going into it. And that has a whole host of effects on both the chemistry, the physical properties, and the biology of the lake, resulting in very low dissolved oxygen at the lake bottom. And there's a cascade of effects as a result of that.
Okay. Thank you, Brendan. Here's a sort of provocative question, I guess. Don't we need salt to make roads safe? Isn't public safety more important than the effects on lakes?
So I think what the important thing to consider that we all need to think about with this conversation is, in the past, we haven't taken into consideration or fully understood what the effects are on the environment and what the effects are on groundwater and human health and safety as a result, through that pathway. So the important thing moving forward is that we are finding a better balance between public safety on our roads, protection of our environment, as well as the protection of our drinking water supplies. And that we need to make sure that when we have conversations about safety, that we're looking at it from all of these different perspectives and not just a single perspective of what's happening on the road. But I will say that there's plenty of evidence out there that we could reduce our salt use in New York State substantially and keep our roads just as safe as they are today. And we've seen that in case study after case study, not only nationally, but within us right here in our own backyard.
Great, thank you, Brendan. We have time for one last question, and I think it's a good one to end on. So folks on this webinar, many of you may not be aware, but there is a bill that's made its way through the legislature called the Randy Preston Road Salt Reduction Act. And so could you speak a little bit, Brendan, about the importance of that act in terms of addressing a lot of these concerns that you brought up this morning?
Yeah, so that would form a task force of representatives within New York State, DOT, Department of Health, DEC, as well as outside experts with particular areas of expertise to review the practices in New York State, as well as technologies and best practices that could be adopted within New York State to reduce our salt use, as well as establish a regional pilot program here in the Adirondacks. So there have been pilot projects by DOT in the past, but they've been fairly limited in their scope, very specific sections of road. And so this would expand those efforts to the entirety of the Adirondack Park. So it's a very important step forward for New York State to address this problem. And I'll just end by saying that the groundwater impacts are something that should be particularly concerning, because lakes have variable flushing rates, but if we change our practices around the lake, they will respond in a reasonable amount of time, a number of years, to that change in management. Groundwater is, an order or orders of magnitude longer in its response time to a change in practices. So, there is some urgency that we start working at a broader level on addressing this issue within New York State.
Thank you, Brendan. And so we're at the end of our time for Brendan. We appreciate having him on. Again, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A that weren't answered, but we'll try to get those offline. So our final panelist is Chris Navitsky. And Chris can appear, that'd be great. And Chris is going to talk to us about one of our other threats, issues here in the Adirondacks and elsewhere, and that is septic systems. Go ahead, Chris.
Great. I will share the screen. And good morning, everyone. Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Zoe, as well as the Consortium for this opportunity. We'll take a quick look into our science to solutions approach for septic system improvement around Lake George. What you're seeing here is a map that shows the 6,000 septic systems that are within the Lake George Basin. These dots indicate parcels with on-site wastewater treatment systems. As we've referred to them, are septic systems. We've taken out the areas which are around Lake George Village and Bolton Landing and Ticonderoga, which are within the municipal sewer collection systems. So you can see that there's a large number of septic systems that are being taken. And when we overlay our 40 years of water quality testing with the Fund for Lake George and our partners at the Darien Freshwater Institute, this is a map of indications of chlorophyll A, indicators of algae growth, productivity in the lake. Red indicates concentrations greater than 2 milligrams per liter. Green is below 1 milligram per liter. So you can see the red and orange in the South Basin where we have much higher concentration, much higher development. So clearly those areas are more productive. And what we are seeing around the lake is an increase in algae growth. We're seeing increased productivity around. These are photos from our observations around the lake. So clearly nutrients are getting into the lake from various impacts of development, but septic systems are one of them. So what have we been using? Littoral biomonitoring, and I have to give a quick shout out to one of my colleagues who I saw in the participants, Karina Parnapi, who helped us with setting this program up here at the Fund for Lake George. But algae, we're taking a look at the algae, the species, the identification, because they can really help us pinpoint pollutants, identify organic pollution. When the coliform testing, the water quality testing, which is a snapshot, you take a quick water sample, but the algae lives in the water, lives in the community, and really can tell a story on how the water quality is changing, the various species that are adaptive to those increased nutrients. And there are protocols and identification that apply metrics, and you can use that to learn more about the potential sources and what the trophic index or the influence of nutrients is to your water body. Here you can see a picture on some collection techniques that were used, using a syringe, collecting that off the existing substrate. But as we've learned more, we've tried to fine tune our work plan, taking out variabilities and questions. In the last year, we moved to actually standardizing our substrate to reduce potential variability on substrates, as well as reducing the time. So we take clay tiles now, a set area, 6-inch by 6-inch tiles. We leave them in the lake for a month period, and we basically will take those samples out and scrape the algae off and send that to a lab for identification. You can see on the right side, we've set concrete blocks, standardized angles, put them at southern exposures to really try to limit the variability. And within a month period, we can capture what is really happening at that time. We're very excited to get our first rounds of data, and we back this year, and we are putting these in bays where we have concerns about septic systems. Taking a look at some of our research of septic systems, this is from the Lake George Septic Initiative project. And our findings, we actually had a grant, worked with the town of Lake George, evaluated and analyzed over 400 parcels that were within 500 feet of the shoreline of Lake George and 100 feet of the streams tributary to the lake. And the numbers are striking and alarming. You know, of that, about 1/3 of the systems are under their normal life expectancy. That's about 30 to 40 years, depending on the use and other site characteristics variability. About 1/3 of the systems have exceeded their life expectancy, so the soils that are so important in treatment are getting impacted. But 1/3 of the systems, no known information. People do not know where their systems are. 50% of the septic tanks are undersized or no information. Septic tanks are based on the size, number of bedrooms. So you can see if your tank's not big enough, you don't have enough volume to properly treat the solids. And most alarming is over 50% of systems have no record or have never been maintained. The simplest way to make your system last for decades is to pump it every 3 to 4 years. If people are not doing that, that leads to premature failure, clogging soils, and the leaching of nutrients into our water bodies. So what are we doing about that? Well, a few of our solutions, worked with the town of Queensbury in the Dunham's Bay area, which is a small bay in the southeastern corner of the lake. They noticed the increased algae growth. We were working with the homeowners, took samples of the algae, did a similar inventory review of the septic systems, much smaller data set, but you can see the same trends and patterns. 21% of the systems were permitted, 14 were marginal information, but 2/3 undocumented. We did not know the status of those systems. This was justification for the town of Queensbury to form a wastewater management district to inspect systems. Our organization provide catalyzing $160,000 in grants. And now we can see that the systems are improving the water quality. This illustration shows red parcels. Septic systems have not been replaced, and we see the red exclamation point. Green areas, systems replaced. We can see an increasing trend in better water quality through algae monitoring. Again, our septic initiative with the town of Lake George, we also utilize GIS to evaluate the systems and come up with a prioritization map. So 3 layers of GIS data, the first being site suitability, what actually characteristics help a system, depth to groundwater, set back to surface waters, depth to bedrock, your soil information, your porosity, your slopes. So here you can see red is bad, green is good. So we created a rating system. We also did that for the septic systems during our evaluation of those 400+ parcels. on the age of the system, on the components of the system. Were they sized properly? Were they permitted? Were they maintained? Have they been inspected? And our third data set was our algae biomonitoring. So we put all those 3 layers together, and you can start seeing that we are calling out these red areas where there's concerns. You can see the red circles where we had algae of concern noted, the red spots on the land, concerned septic systems. So we came up in the town with 10 priority areas for the town to take a look at so that they can focus their limited resources on improving septic systems in those areas. The last solution that we have is this past year, we announced our Safe Septic Systems Initiative, a complete guide from fixing to financing. And I'll take a quick walk to the website. We put a website up, safesepticsystems.org. So here you can see, you can scroll down where here again, you can see the algae problems that we're seeing. You know, algae loves the nutrients from all these systems. Again, you can see that 6,000 systems, if we use that 2/3 ratio, about 4,000 could be at risk. But the biggest thing we had with this initiative is our partnership with 2 local banks that are actually going to provide low and no interest loans to people that want to upgrade their systems. You know, and that's the way we like to reach for our solutions here at the fund. The other thing with this is we provided simple questions for people to ask about their system. You know, do they know anything about their system? Getting to know your system, and then there's ways that they can go find out more because we have a detailed guide here as well. If you follow the various prompts through there. So with that, I will close this presentation and take it over for questions from that may be out there.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so I think we'll start off with one that, so you show that, so Lake George has a, we'll just read it. Lake George has a comprehensive septics program, which is important in a model. However, septics are an issue throughout the park. And so what can we do to educate local governments and residents park-wide to expand your model program and implement science-based approaches park-wide?
Well, I think the first thing is education is always important. You know, we provided a guide that obviously was around Lake George, but it's the same approach to any water body. Educating people on what they need to know about their system, what are the troubles, what are the do's and don'ts. We have that guidebook at that Safe Septic Systems website, so people can understand. And then we can work with municipalities. We'd be glad to reach out with folks and set these up. But the simplest thing people can do is pump their system out every 3 to 4 years. And they'll learn about 90% of what they need to know about their system and whether it's functioning. Another thing that has started to catch on is the transfer inspection law. When properties transfer, make sure those properties are inspected and upgraded if needed. And that's another way that, you know, it's not just Lake George, but that can be implemented elsewhere.
Thanks, Chris. Here's a question about, so you've been rolling this out. What has the response been from homeowners? I think you addressed this part. Is there money available for homeowners to upgrade and maintain? How do you get folks to comply with the recommendations?
Yeah, well, we wanted to roll this out. We had a septic summit plan. This was going to be rolled out. Obviously, pandemic came in, so we've had to roll this out virtually. It came out over the summer. You know, people don't want to upgrade their systems over the summer. You know, they want to enjoy the lake. Through our banks, there has actually been a total of 5 applications that have gone through since midsummer when this was rolled out. We are now going to be doing a meet and greet with the towns now that there's public meetings again, putting out rack cards so that people find out about it. So that's how we want to get the word out there more. And I'm sorry, the second part, Dan, of that question was
just how to encourage.
Oh, there was other questions
Yeah.
on financing.
Yeah.
You know, we provided some catalyzing money. We were working with Warren County to try to get listed through the EFC on the infrastructure program, which we have not been successful at, you know, trying to get some state money. And we know that getting grants are going to be a little more difficult in these times. So we're trying to find out more about that, how to bring resources in. But that's going to be trouble for a lot of communities moving forward.
Are there any simple tests that homeowners can perform to determine whether their septic system is performing properly?
The first thing they do is try to find out if they have plans. Do they know where their system is? That's the first thing. If you don't have a plan, you know, the simplest thing is really to find out where your tank is, have that pumped out. If you pump your tank out, you can find out about, as I said, 90% about your system. Is the tank cracked? Is it sized properly for your number of bedrooms? Do you have water coming in? If you pump it out and water is coming into your tank from your outlet, that means that your field is clogged, and that is probably the worst sign that you could have. If you're having water come into the tank, that means you probably have a leaky tank or a leaky toilet, cracked pipes. So really the simplest thing you can do is have your tank pumped out, and you'll learn a lot about your system just from simply doing that.
Right. Is there the ideal septic system, like a new technology that you're really promoting?
Great question. There are what we call the enhanced systems, the ETUs, which a simple septic tank now, solids settle out, and you allow the soils to do the majority of the treatment through the biology and chemical adhesion and absorption. Now they actually put mini treatment plants into septic tanks, providing aeration, providing different media for microbes to form on to help treat that. Various systems like the Claris system, MBRs. So there is now a good list of about 10 to 15. I will say that New York State DOH has been a little slow on the newer technologies. We lag behind some other states, but you know, it's the enhanced treatment systems that we really want to get people to look at, especially in these tight parcels with site constraints close to our water bodies. Very important. Good question.
Great, thanks. Do you see any, so kind of thinking about relationships between these three topics, do you see in Lake George or in other areas correlations between failing septic systems and presence of invasive species?
You know, there may be, our concern has always been maybe with road salt and invasive species, with the chlorides and the way that the breakdown of the salt interacts with the soils and the release of calcium. The same thing with septic systems to a little bit lesser degree. Obviously, salt is part of human waste that breaks down in soils. The way that the sodium reacts and displaces some of the existing minerals in the soils, raising our calcium. So yeah, there can be definitely that connection, as well as, you know, the algae changing the ecosystem and how that can also make it more conducive to invasive species and non-native species, non-native algae. And the changing of that basis of our ecosystem through the algae is very key.
Good, thanks. So Chris, you provided you had a lot of excellent resources on that site. So folks are, maybe someone could type that into the chat. That goes right through the fund?
Yes, they can go to the fundforlakegeorge.org. I apologize, I did not have I can put that into the chat box.
Zoe just tapped it in.
Ah, Zoe's on top. Thanks, Zoe. Apologize.
Yeah, so we're getting a lot of interest in finding those resources.
Yep.
Well, this is where we are at the magic minute. I just want to take the last minute to thank everyone, Erin, Brendan, and Chris for being on this panel, and thank the Adirondack Research Consortium for organizing this series. Thank all the folks, 88, we ended up with 88 people on this webinar, so fantastic participation from the public, and thank everybody for your questions. There is, you know, folks, please look into the chat and get the information. We have all the email addresses for the panelists there, as well as the website address for the Fund for Lake George, where you can go see all that awesome information that they have available for septic. So thank you. It's 11 o'clock. So thank you, everyone. Thank the panelists for joining us this morning. And please, folks, don't forget next week, next Friday, excellent panel on cultural geography of the Adirondacks, and closing out with a panel the following Friday related to forest policy. So please join those webinars as well. So have a great weekend, everybody.